The key I want you to focus on this one is the bottom surface. Okay, this bottom surface is the only element in this model that has that particular material. Okay, does that make sense? So I think I set it to car paint something. What did I set it to? Car paint white. Okay, so actually I have two car paint whites. So let me take this car. Well, I'm going to modify this car paint white. I'm going to change it to car paint gray. There. Okay, so that one's going to become car paint gray. So now the floor is the only thing that is car paint white. So what I want to see here is when you go to your scene manager, I want to see if you go to your settings, scroll down. Well, we are going to do alpha, but I don't think it's going to do anything. Well, no, it's not going to do anything in this model. What I want you to check is MaterialID, and, well, do we want Object ID? I don't think we really need Object ID in this case. Anyway, I want you to check MaterialID. So this is another render channel that you're going to be able to modify in a few different ways. And I actually think it's incredibly nifty. So let's just quickly look through our settings. It doesn't really matter that critically. I could leave it on constant dome theoretically for this one. Resolution looks fine for what I'm using it for. And I'm set to production and intensity. So let me run a quick draft render of this, and we'll take it into Photoshop in just a minute, so hang tight. All right, so this isn't going to be, let me just put it plainly, it's not going to be great because the rendering, I only rendered it for 5 minutes. So I do just want to show you another way of overlaying, perhaps something like a material. But this is kind of one of those things that you would use more artistically than you would technically, right? Because if you really wanted a floor to look real, you'd probably render it and put the actual material in your rendering with a bump map, with reflections and everything like that. So this is definitely a rendering or a representation technique more than it is a rendering technical application. So anyway, with this rendering, what I did was, obviously I turned on the MaterialID. Well, the MaterialID functions very, very similarly to the way an alpha mask does, to the effect that it actually creates a map that looks like this. It's a colored map. And it's different for every material that is present in the scene. So when I save this image, I'm going to set it to save all channels. And I'm going to go to the same location I was in. Let's see. I want to go to 00 dump. I'm going to call this one room mat ID and set it to PNG. Hit save. Just make sure that I need to make sure I still have save all channels on and not embedded channels. So that's going to be, I'm going to hit OK. And then that should show up here, room mat ID and room mat ID material. Okay, so it's just like an alpha map. So let's go into Photoshop. And I'm going to use this sort of as a, actually let me just pull the image in first. So let's pull the PNG in as a new file, like that. The important thing here that I want you to focus on is that we're using this as a masker, right? So the fact that it happens to be different colors is something that we can just sort of pick and select, right? So I showed you the color selection tool. When I drop this material map onto it, it shows up in color, not like the alpha map. Okay, so there are different ways we can play around with this. You can go into the RGB channels and stuff like that and isolate different color ranges, but I want you to think simply. I want you to think about the fact that we can actually just select that material using the magic wand, as long as it's a high enough resolution image. And then what we're going to do is duplicate this background layer. And actually, what am I thinking of? No, not duplicating the layer. Oh, I know what I wanted to do. Sorry. I want to find a material to apply to it. So let's go to, let's say we want to show like a wood floor material. So I'm going to go here and say, you could say material wood floor. What you want to find is something that's more of like a texture material. So something like this. It's pretty high res, and it shows a lot of planks. So let's copy this. Let's put it in Photoshop. I Control V pasted it. And what I'm going to do here that's really important is I'm going to rotate it and shrink it down to approximately the size of where that corner meets this corner. Okay. What's really key here is that we can actually, well, let me shrink it down this way too, kind of crunch it down onto the scene. This can all be modified later, but what I want to show you here is mapping a material manually. Whoa, what happened there? So unfortunately I don't have the exact spot that it starts and stops, but you can do something like this and it's approximately where the floor is, right? We can still modify this later. So the key, I mean, like, you can go in and Photoshop this and crop it out and do all the stuff like to the actual layer that modifies this particular material and the map that I inserted, but I can utilize this MaterialID to allow me to modify it a little bit more autonomously. And what I mean by that is if I select that layer just like that, right? Like that is my material. Or if I have that material in different spots, I would use the color selection tool. But this is the spot I want to modify now. I can go to layer 1. I can create a reveal mask for it. And see how it automatically creates a black and white mask? Did you guys see that? Because I had something selected and I created the layer mask, it automatically created the layer mask for me. So when I turn this off, that floor goes away around the sphere. Pretty cool stuff, right? Now, when you get into more advanced stuff, you can do like shadow maps and all this other stuff, and we'll get into that sort of stuff so that the shadow under the sphere doesn't go away, but I don't want to overload you on too many things at once. I want you to get used to modifying things. So what I also want to show you here is this particular material can continue to be modified, which is pretty awesome. So I can right-click, hit Free Transform, and now I can actually start to sort of stretch this thing. Oh, no, it didn't. Oh, did I? Oh, because they're tied. All right, hang on. There we go. Disconnect it. Free Transform. This should do it. Oh, hang on. It's been a while, guys, since I did this one. Let me look this up, because this can be done, and I think I just did it wrong. Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to dig this one up. I, for the life of me, can't recall. But anyway, so what I'd like you to do is go through the process of finding a space in your model that you can actually utilize this, and you can map it in. But I do want to point out that this particular element, as it is right now, even though I'm going for that sort of decoupage look, probably still needs to be blended with the source material itself. So what I would suggest is selecting your layer and maybe starting to blend the opacity a little bit so it starts to fall back into the scene. Okay, and you don't have to do it a lot. It does kind of, I mean, you see that it kind of dulls it out to all the gray that was in the scene. It depends on what your rendering is going to really call for, how much light is in the scene. But if you have to bring the opacity down so low that it gets really dull, what you can do is modify sort of the brightness and contrast a little bit. You can bump the brightness up, something like that, give it more contrast, give it a little bit more saturation, that sort of thing. And it just starts to make it a little bit more of a cohesive sort of texture. Okay, you're sort of tricking the eye into thinking that it's part of the rendering. Okay. What questions do you have? Okay, let me dig into this a little bit. So I guess for like the next 20 minutes or so, go through this process and I'll come around to help you guys out. I save the file before I put it into Photoshop?
The color mask.
It's the same thing we did for the alpha mask, except when you export it, you're going to have your render layer and you're going to have your mask, your material ID layer. Does that make sense? And then you export it just like you did the alpha mask, and it's going to come out with both of those layers as separate files.